I'm audible.
Hi, you're audible.
Oh. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We believe that insofar the economy right now is based off how the environment is like. We think that we are willing to take the short-term pinch in terms of maybe some form of unemployment or some form of like negative benefit cost in the short term. If it means in the long term, we are a lot more sustainable. Very proud to be on opening government. Our model is very simple. It's a 3-tiered model. The first is that we will increase interest rates for companies who don't hit a certain quota of green or who pollute a lot. So the cost of borrowing increases if they want to get money to do things like projects or like large-scale projects. These are things that you're not going to get the money for. Or at the very least, if you want to like set up these things, you're going to have to pay a lot more in terms of like your upfront cost. Second is that refusal to buy bonds from companies that pollute too much, and also the refusal to fund projects that specifically have a large amount of pollution. That is to say that if your company, for example, wants to build like it's a construction company that wants to build like houses, you're gonna have to find a new way, for example, to build it in an eco-friendly way, right? Or not, we will not award you that particular bond, or at the very least, it will be one of the main considerations as to whether we accord you the bond or not. Lastly, we won't lend to frackers. This is very simple. That is to say that like for new like up and coming environmentally unfriendly things, we're just not going to lend you anything, right? That's very simple. Our stance, right, is that these things mean a lot to companies, and the way in which that like they affect companies are going to lead a net good environmental outcome, and we'll explain why this is important. Why do these things matter a lot to companies? For a few reasons. They need this money in order to get startup costs, right? That is to say that to create, okay, wait, before that, it's probably not about big companies because they already have their own private investors and they probably don't already engage the government to begin with. But we think that if there are big companies that specifically rely on government bonds in order to increase their profit margins as a whole, and we make it more expensive for them to do so, you'll probably also still have to shift towards what's that thing called? Yeah, environmentally more friendly stuff. Cool. What do these things mean a lot to companies? For startups, they need this money to get startup costs. Let's say that to create a company, you need to get loans and you need to like cover like things like, for example, like your equipment and all of that stuff, right? Why are you likely to borrow from like a central bank versus a private bank? Firstly, there's lower barriers to entry, right? Because and the interest rate is not that high. The second is because the power of the control bank is that they control liquidity and they control interest rates. That's to say that they have a large money supply and therefore it's more desirable versus a private bank. Lastly, I think that like this, and I think all these reasons just mean that they're likely to want to like get it from the central fund versus a private bank. Second, one of the main ways they get bonds and get projects is to get state-funded bonds. Because the reason why, right, is because when like states award things like projects and award things like buying bonds if it's deem your company worthy, insofar, let's say, for example, I guess let's say my father's company, One Berry, right, gets a contract from the Singaporean government to build certain roads and to build certain things. You get repute as a result versus, for example, right, you don't get like private investors or like other things that are like a lot lower in terms of like yield of return. You get a lot of more repute when governments buy your bonds because your company is then seen as something very stable. Thirdly, we target a bunch of revenue streams for big companies, right? Think about it this way. If companies are profit maximizing, that means they need these bonds in order to like maximize your profits, right? So governments pay them in order to, let's say, like currently pay them, for example, to, I don't know, build roads or like to subsidize certain projects, right? The issue here is that when they buy less bonds or when they buy less things, right, it necessarily means that like the profit stream becomes a lot lower. So sure, it is still profitable, but it comes a point where the cost of you building a green project is like cheaper versus, let's say, for example, you continuing to pollute. There comes a point where it's just a lot better to install your solar, like the short-term cost of your solar panels, or let's say, for example, the short-term cost of like you polluting less, like and the government punitively punishing you for it, right? And you're likely to just want to switch to green alternatives in general. Lastly, and this is important, it cuts the ability for new polluting companies to exist. No startup cost means no ability to frack, no ability to like inject oil. All of these things is just like very intuitive. Why is it good? Firstly, new companies who want to pollute like have to find new and innovative ways in order to like not pollute as much, right? So for instance, and the companies that are specifically existing to pollute right now don't exist, right? Or at least we prevent up and coming pollution companies from existing as well. This is important because this also means that the propensity to pollute in the future is a lot less, right? Second, we allow for like companies are likely to then have to have what's the thing called? Integrate greener policies, right, within their companies in order to ensure that like they don't get penalized for it. Lastly, existing companies to a degree have to, like big companies like Amazon have to then switch to environmentally more friendly stuff in order to not get punitively screwed over. Before I move on, any PORs? 3, 2, 1. cool, you can just mark them down for lack of engagement. This is important, right? And this is what Ian has been telling me for the whole prep. Why is it that green is very important? One, I think that like the lives lost because of like the huge amount of pollution is something that you cannot understate. Cataracts, acid rain, non-potable water because of like and your water being pink in the Michigan like pipeline crisis. It's a loss of lives. It's a large decrease in the standard of living. Insofar you cannot access your life to begin with. Things like jobs, maybe for example, if Op wants to push that particular line, don't exist to the point in which you're not alive and to the point in which you're not well. These are things that that continue. These are things right that means that like also in the future you economically cannot perform, right? So sure, Amazon might be able to like hire this amount of capacity as of now. But if everyone starts dying in Amazon and everyone starts like kind of like, if everyone starts dying in Amazon, right? And if everyone kind of starts like be getting sick in Amazon, for instance, right? And your productivity levels go down a lot because you are unable to produce to the same capacity given the decrease in standard of living. Why is this more important then versus the odd push specifically from things like, for example, I don't know, unemployment or things like, for example, if they want to push things like, if they want to push things like, oh no, but people will not have any jobs, what will happen to these industries? Firstly, I think that like it's a slow and gradual process. So I don't necessarily think that like we're going to like immediately dismantle these industries, but we can argue for slow and gradual change. Second is I would trade off those particular jobs if it means that in the long term, not only do these people live, but they become more productive in the future. Sure, there's a short-term loss in terms of like profitability and the ability for you to generate more income. But in the long term, it's to the point in which that like your factors of production, like your labor and whatever, becomes a lot more productive and therefore is able to churn out more money in the future. Lastly, and I think this is very important to note, resources are scarce. We are running out of fossil fuel, we're running out of oil, we're running out of all of these things, right? In the future, if we don't stop polluting or we don't find other greener alternatives, these things run out in the future, and therefore there comes a point where you stop profiting because you don't have like any resources to profit off of, right? Therefore, we think that when we force companies to look for other alternatives, right? So things like, for example, like more greener ways of like creating energy or other ways in which to replace things like, for example, metal or like intermediary points of production, right? It's to the point in which I think that like we don't deplete these resources a lot. We don't deplete these resources to like to the degree we are doing right now. And in the future, we can then profit off better. Very proud to be an opening government.
For that, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that very fine speech, calling upon Leader of Opposition to open the case on side opening up. Here.
I'm audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Yes, let me just get my timer. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Environmental practices can never be enforced by central banks. This is because, firstly, it will not be effective, it's contradictory to its other objectives, it leads to more harms, and finally, there are better ways to disincentivize environmentally harmful practices. The motion say that central banks are plural, which means the central banks across developing and the developed world. And secondly, central banks are operationally independent. This means that the government cannot set interest rates, monetary policy. This means that we still allow the state to enact policy that's green or eco-friendly, just not under the central bank banner. I think the one key thing that opening government just forgot to point out is that the central bank has other responsibilities, right? Ojo just mention about its other responsibilities at all. What are the goals and obligations of central banks in general, right? This could be low and stable inflation rate and monetary policy. This can make sure banks could run out. This keeping the financial system stable, right? Making sure failing banks don't cause widescale problems and a lender of last resort, right? This means that note that this is the only stakeholder level of dependence of the state, right, of the authority that they have in order to regulate monetary policy. They're not replaceable, which means that no other stakeholder can fill the gap that central banks provide in protecting and providing for the economy, right? Why does central bank implementing environmental practices will undermine other objectives and goals that there is to achieve, right? First, let's characterize what these environmental factors look like. This could be less CO2 emissions, less greenhouse gases, user greening technology, implementing monetary policy to combat these problems. This could be primary and secondary regulation, for example, telling banks to not borrow to companies that are environmentally friendly, right? In a world that's so economically dependent, we must ensure that banks are run well. As you know, OG said, firms are profit driven, right? Their main incentive is profit, which means that they're more likely not going to be eco-friendly on both sides of the house, which means that in most firms in the world today, even if they're becoming more eco-friendly, they're still going to be not carbon neutral, for example, use oil and gas, etc. We understand this and we accept this on the side. But this means that during a recession, let's say, for example, the 28 crash, right? For example, the GM and Ford industry, the car industry was going bankrupt, which means that these companies are the biggest provider of cars in the US, right? And these are big firms, big businesses. They own 10,000, they hire tens of thousands of people, and they're really prominent in economic activity in the car industry. Which means that a bank as a lender of last resort, right? If the central bank didn't bail them out in 2008, right? Which means because they're not environmentally friendly, as you know, GM and Ford are known for being, using a lot of unsustainable methods, right? This means that not only many jobs are lost in this scenario, more people are going to be worse off in this, right? The economy is so affected that it damages the economy significantly, right? Supply chains will lose their buyers, more people will be made redundant, less supply in the economy leading to higher inflation rates. This means that if the central bank values environmental practices over economic stability, since they're polar opposites in the first place, this undermines the other objective that it has, as I mentioned before, right? Of lower stable inflation rates, making sure failing banks don't cause wider scale problems, and a lender of last resort. This means, for example, in another example could be like, for example, this is exacerbated due to COVID and the war in Ukraine. For example, let's say a leading research company or a medicine company trying to develop a vaccine for COVID, right, or for future pandemics or crises. This means these companies trying to save lives, right, millions of lives with this vaccine, with this product, with this, product that's developing, right? But most likely these companies are not going to be completely eco-friendly, as I said before, because companies are trying to make profit, which means they're going to cut corners. This means that there's going to be less on government side, it's going to be less borrowing, less lending to these companies, right? Which means that there's going to be less vaccine success, more lives lost, and worse for the well-being of people, and less economic activity. Because of the fact that the objectives clash fundamentally, they're never going to work. We're not saying that environmental practices should not be enacted in the first place, right? But because of the nature of the central bank in general, this responsibility should not go to them. It can go to another body, for example, the state, NGOs, other bodies that can enact this environmental policy. But the central bank's primary objective not to undermine its other responsibilities of low and stable relations. Another example. I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so you do understand, even in the cases of crisis, the central banks have something called as the theory of moral hazard, right? That they cannot be funding unsustainable practices, which is the role of the central bank. So you've been dissing on the central banks for not being able to do this when they have the express mandate to do this, especially in the age of unsustainable practices such as mining, such as coal, such as the energy.
I understand.
So how do you replace the central bank?
I understand that the central bank, of course, like in scenarios where it's super unethical, and like in terms of businesses that are super unethical and damaging the environment and harming people, of course, and damaging the environment in the first place, of course, the central bank probably has some, rules and regulations to actually balance this. But because the central bank has other responsibilities, as I said before, right? The overall, if you just continually to give the central bank the responsibility to implement to disincentivize environmentally harmful practices, it's overall going to undermine its other responsibilities, as I mentioned before. Obviously, there's other scenarios, but this is just not the case, right? And secondly, this alternative, since corporations are bigger polluters and contributors to global warming, alternatives disincentivize harmful environmental practices, right? This could include trying to internally restructure corporations to be more environmentally friendly, for instance, to working alter some of their practices in dumping and polluting, right? This could be showing corporations that there are certain benefits to being environmentally friendly, such as economic benefits, right? This could be saying that corporations can be part of solutions rather than saying they're evil in totality and we're unable to engage with them and to have a good environmental system in the future, right? Giving the consultants buying shares in their companies, for example, right? Or any other action, literally, and any other stakeholder to be involved besides the central bank, for example, NGOs, NPOs, government regulations, right? This could, even if these are not mutually exclusive, we think that this is happening increasingly. And if they are effective in contributing to the combating global warming, as well as we can anyway, right? We think that central banks is to be, if central banks are to be involved, this detracts from the activism of mass protest that will be directed at the government and other stakeholders, because now environmentalists shift their focus to central banks and advocate for central banks to do certain things, right? This reduces the impedance of the stakeholders to continue alternatives we mentioned. So this is some trade-off that government has to justify by showing that central banks will not be the same, but significantly more effective on their in this alternative stakeholder. And secondly, we think that central banks should prioritize protecting the environment and maintaining minimum quality of life for poor, especially in developing countries, right? Even if government-centered policy of central banks involves the state in some climate change mitigation, right? This trade-off is severe, right? The more it prioritizes environmental actions, the less it prioritizes on economic and things like lowering inflation. This necessarily hurts the most poor around the world. Note that even in most developed countries, most of the poor have close to nothing or in debt or rely on wages. They live hand to mouth. This is like, in the best of the countries. In the developing world, wealth inequality is massive, and this means the majority of the population live below the breadline. They cannot afford to property and pay for rental and prices keep increasing. They cannot keep dealing with pandemics and slow down economies worldwide to avoid a looming recession, right? This is because, for example, in the case of COVID, right, small businesses who couldn't compete shut down. This restaurants, tourism, like more centralism of the economy and less diversification. More businesses shutting down because governments have less tax revenue spending on the service delivery, medium infrastructure like housing, right? More jobs lost loss and rely on the state and social service to provide welfare for people, weakening of democratic and infrastructure institutions, and poor countries becoming more in debt and facing a debt crisis. All these issues because the environment, the central bank cannot manage, both sides of the coin at the same time, because environmental actions and environmental practices are completely opposites of central bank responsibilities that it already has, and that's why central banks can never be justified to enact environmental practices, and that's our project was.
I'd like to thank the leader for that fine speech, calling upon the BPM to extend the case on site opening government. Here.
Hello, this is Ian. Could I please check if I can be heard clearly? There's a little bit of background noise, I know, but it's okay.
Yep, you're audible.
Excellent. I will start my speech very soon. Oh, sorry. The main problem with opening opposition is that they do not engage with the comparative, because it is not a comparative between no climate change and a world without climate change, whereby if central banks do not intervene, nothing happens, and if central banks do intervene, an economic disaster happens. It is a world where climate change is going to happen if we do not intervene right now. That is to say, they do not deal with the infrastructure damage that happens because of repeated floods and intensified hurricanes. They do not deal with the repeated floods that will happen as sea levels rise. They do not deal with the refugee crises, which are really terrible for the economy across the world, right? Developed and developing. They don't deal with any of this. What was that mechanism? That's the first thing I'm going to hit. That mechanism was, we will show and demonstrate to companies that what they're doing is bad. Companies know ExxonMobil has been raising the level of its platforms to account for sea level rise for decades. Companies know what they're doing is pollutive. The reason why they haven't done it is because it doesn't hit their bottom line. These people know what they're doing is destructive, and the reason why they haven't adjusted because it has not impacted their profit margins yet. Central banks therefore have a unique position to make sure it hurts their profit margins by making sure they cannot buy bonds to be able to carry out fracking, and fracking becomes more expensive. Now they have to turn to cheaper alternatives because the only reason why they're doing fracking to begin with is because it's the cheaper way to get energy, right? When companies we rely on less effective methods of processing coal, and we can actually increase the amount of interest rates on them for when they want to take out loans to do this. That's the point at which you can hurt their profit margin and change the incentives of behavior. None of this material from where the speech was engaged with. Therefore, opening opposition is out of this debate because they do not deal with the massive harm of climate change in a way it will destroy the economy. Therefore, I've got 3 questions in this speech, all of which we'll keep engaging and hopefully take out of both closings as well. Firstly, what are the priorities of central banks? Why uniquely is it that central banks have to do this? We said that central banks uniquely have 2 features. Firstly, that is state's way of controlling the economy. That's to say that they're the unique way by which the state has any form of intervention into the economy. As compared to this, private banks pursue the short-term interest that they have. We saw this in the 2008 financial crisis, for example, when Lehman Brothers were a really bad actor and pursued short-term financial the hurt of the economy as a whole. We also said that therefore only central bank is controlled by the state, and especially the state therefore has the incentive to protect people in the long term because the voters are going to be there for life, right? Therefore, these are individual. That's why they carry out long-term infrastructure development projects, for example. That's why uniquely central banks can consider the effects of climate change that will accrue 5-10 years down the line, like private banks might not. But secondly, they protect the interests of the state. So therefore, in addition to protecting the economy, they also protect the interests of the state. Notice that these things sometimes are mutually exclusive, right? For example, cigarette companies are very, very profitable. But the reason why central banks do not invest in them is because the state recognizes that these cigarette companies are really dangerous to our people, right? Therefore, even if we take the entire government benchmark arguments as true and we will have some economic costs, the fact that the state as a whole recognizes that killing people is bad and we need to protect the safety of our citizens, it's probably something that central banks have to prioritize. I take that POI.
How can you ensure all the corporation in your country is going to follow it?
Yeah, fiat power. Firstly, we have the fiat power to say that we don't give them money. Companies do things when they get money to do them. Companies don't do things when things are more expensive. Actually, I'm moving right on to this. How is it therefore that we fulfill these economic policies better? Because environmental destruction destroys the economy, right? When repeated floods mean that you have to constantly reconstruct infrastructure, and your state and your central bank especially has to keep giving out more and more subsidies to houses, for example. When the housing market will crash because the odds of you being able to buy a new house at the shoreline, especially which is when 95% of cities and towns are, is literally a terrible investment now because of the odds of floods happening, right? Because individuals cannot go into work because they're suffering the effects of climate change. Because crop yields are being hurt, because crop catchment areas are affected by climate change. Because at the end of the day, rates of rainfall have been affected by acid rain hurts crop yields. Because at the end of the day, when your climate changes by 1 or 2 degrees, that's the point at which you are no longer in the safety zone for crops to be able to grow and flourish, right? When all of these things happen, that's the point at which your economy is hurt. Because if you're not able to have an agricultural market, for example, you're not able to help people in the long term. Why uniquely is it that central banks have to do this as compared to private banks? Private banks are oftentimes prioritized with profit in the short term. Central banks aren't. They know that they have to take care of the economy in 5-10 years because individuals appointed to the central banks serve long terms, right? As a result, if I know that in 10 years or in 5 years, the economy is going to be fucked because of the policies that I did now, I will look after my own ass and protect these individuals in the long term. Therefore, central banks uniquely are the ones who are best suited for this. A second reason is because they have reserves. Because we do agree to a certain extent that there might be economic harms. And in our absolute worst case scenario, there might be a recession. Fine, let's bite that bullet. Uniquely, central banks and especially governments often have reserves in tow to be able to be deployed the point at which a recession happens in the short term. But in order to deploy these resources effectively, they have to anticipate this recession. That is to say that if I anticipate that the reason why these economic harms are deployed is because of my actions, I can compensate these individuals properly with my reserves. Compare this and contrast this to floods, agricultural destruction, which I often cannot predict, which just happens and a hurricane hits my cities and boom, that's the point at which the recession is so much more harder and harder to compensate. The house are actually far better necessarily effective. So this poses up any CO extension of why the policy might not affect companies. We can use several mechanisms in a way that I will reinforce and add on to at the point in which this policy is effective. Number one, it deprives large companies of another source of capital. That's to say that large companies also often there's own of money investors can give, right? The point at which companies need more money often from central banks, which have large amounts of funding because they are oftentimes conglomerates of multiple banks join in one. And because they can access government revenues from taxpayer dollars. The reason why these companies need so much money to carry out their businesses but cannot find the amount in private investors is the point at which they have to turn to central banks. The point at which central banks tell them, fuck off, you cannot frack anymore, is the point at which they stop fracking, right? That's the point at which we're able to affect big companies as well and force them to look into other markets to get their energy, right? But then they told us that, these other companies are doing things like vaccines, and these vaccines are good for society. I'm not sure how vaccines hurt the environment. I think that we're probably going to be targeting things like frackers. We're targeting people who drill oil and coal mines. If you want to hurt like Pfizer and you want to tell me how Pfizer hurts the atmosphere, then okay, DLO do that. We would say that therefore, on our side of the house, we deprive large companies of all of these effects. But secondly, we will say that it signals private banks to do the same thing. The point at which, for example, a central bank is a large monetary authority is able to set interest rates as well as rate other companies. So they can rate them AAA, they can rate them like B standard, for example. It's the point at which the private banks have the signaling effect not to provide loans to these because these are bad investments. Therefore, because the central bank oftentimes have a lot of authorities there who are experts in the financial field. But lastly, and this is super important, we hurt the ability of startup companies to keep coming up. So even if, for example, a large company turns away from fracking, the market is still there in the opposition bench. And that's why we stop smaller companies from being opened up to be able to carry out fracking activities. At the end of the day, OG gives you a whole bunch of mechanisms as to why this is successful. We give you the unique moral obligation of central banks to protect the state, to protect the economy, and the way the environment screws with all of this in the long term. So proud to propose. Thank you.
Right, I'd like to thank the DPM for that fine speech, calling upon the DLO to extend the case on OO. Here.
Here in the chat, please. I'm setting my timer. So, okay. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. First thing, I'm going to map out recession is going to happen in the long term, which means you experience a large scale impact in the longer term, which weighs on the same metrics, because if they want to say that you have long term bigger impact in the environmentally, you also have larger impact economically with the recession, which I think OO never mapped out. How does stagflation happens on their side? Firstly, is many countries experiencing the post-COVID recession, right? The service and retail and manufacturing industry are most which generate most of the equally unfriendly things are all being recessed by recurring lockdown policy, where you have supply chain disruptions, which raise the shipping costs, means companies need to make up for that cost by rising prices. You also have, like, regardless of whether a pandemic realistically ends or not, there's private sector risk aversion incentives. So after the Alpha variant, you have Delta and the Omicron right now, which means numerous times restrictions were reimposed, which means the price rise to make up for the unpredictability, and people are not spending under this unpredictability, which means you're not able to incentivize the economy through quantitative easing or whatever other measures to incentivize to recover the economy in the short term. But secondly, I would say that most resource exploitation industries in developing countries are also on the brink of breaking down, right? This is because, like, Saudi Arabia unpredictably manipulating the supply of the oil to leverage against other exporters like Russia, like Venezuela, but also a potential Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and the unpredictability of the Nord Stream plant, which is making it even unclear to what extent the gasoline will be exported, which also affects many of the developing countries that heavily rely on resource exploitation industries, right? But and that means you get longer term weighing on the same metric of, like, economic recession, not like they said, oh, that bigger impact on like environment. But secondly, note that no government bench actually talk about the effectiveness of such policy, right? They do not have fiat for the effectiveness of such policy. And I would say many smaller companies are much harder to change their profit model into environmentally friendly, for reasons why that's true. One, developing countries rely on resource exploitation and exportation industry. They're not likely to change their whole industry structure in the long term. But secondly, even if they can change, you need other sectors to collectively to change, to consume your environmentally friendly products. The consumer behavior also not likely to change in the short term. But thirdly, established product chain manufacturing machine with very high initial cost. The easiest way for companies to, like, cope with this is to just cut the cost to compensate for other higher interest rate, right? But fourthly, I would say the majority of SME who hire most workers are less able to purchase environmentally friendly machines compared to the larger ones. But they're the ones that are already on the margin of getting the loans, of not getting the loans from the bank, i.e. they're the ones that are also likely to bankrupt the first. The impact of this are twofold. Firstly, is I would say the company will cope with your policy by simply leaving the country that have a stricter policy, right? Know that the strength of this motion is implemented is variously. Central banks in certain countries have less strict implementation. That means the more corrupted government can easily be influenced by corporation. This is because, like, more corrupted government can easily be influenced by corporation lobbying power. Know that the central bank rely on lending money to corporations to earn money, which means if big companies leave your country, causing chain reaction, and smaller businesses who need the bank loans are also less able to get loans and are also, like, more likely to go bankrupt. But I would say engage with their strongest case that even if the companies still hire people, what they will do to cope with higher interest rate and less loan to them is they will just offer less former positions with social security safety net, with insurance, and hire much more like contract workers to like cope with this unpredictability in the policy and to lower their cost. What you have then is, I would say, the environmentally harmful practices that often occur in resource exploitation industries that hire many contract workers and gig workers. For example, the miners, for example, the factory workers, they're very scattered. They transfer among like multiple jobs and places. They're not likely to form labor unions to protect themselves. And I would also say the contract does not include like monetary compensation after firing them or labor right protections, which means they're the first people to be fired. Now, weighing this against their best case, I would say firstly, the best case is mitigation of environmental problem in the long term. We firstly win on scale because the recession of your company in long term is impacting livelihood of also all people, but also make your country less able, more economically weaker and less able to negotiate on international realm. When in an international environmental conference, your company specifically is more going to be bullied by other economically better off countries, and your people are more vulnerable facing the climate change. But I also say that this is principally perverse because people who are impacted the most by the climate change are the poorer people because they have less alternative to move to other countries that are flooded later. They have less resources to live in houses that have AC to fend themselves against the effects of climate change. And now the proposition side, yes, you do help some better off people who have more leeway facing climate change, probably they're not the ones that are first to lose their jobs and harm the more vulnerable people at the moment this policy is implemented. Before I move on, I'll take a point from OG.
In our worst case scenario, pollutive companies fail, and then we account for the recession as a central bank. In your world, a long-term recession happens when infrastructure, houses, and lives are destroyed by climate change.
I don't think you're listening very carefully to my case. The case that we say is that recession is going to be long-term, like anyways, right? Yeah, okay, you say, okay, there is going to be high inflation, but on our side, I think through our mechanism, what we prove to you is a stagflation, which infiltrates into other aspects of the economy, not just specifically of the economies in these like environmentally unfriendly industries, but also when the cost of these environmentally unfriendly industries rise, that means there is going to be a spread out effect into other industries because of the rising unpredictability and because of the massive job loss that makes it like harder for the nation to cope with like the redundant labors, right? So the nation need to like allocate more resources to take out more loans from other companies to compensate for the loss of these like unemployed people. That makes this company economically weaker, but also because more people under the unpredictability are not spending their power. So the whole nation's economy is going to also suffer from repression in a longer term, which means on the same comparative that you provide to us, we also prove that it's an even larger economic like recession on your side of the house. We're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the member for that fine speech calling upon government whip. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Hi, yeah, you're audible and visible.
Hello.
Hi, you're audible.
Thank you. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we describe. Okay. Am I audible right now?
Hi, you're audible.
I think there's okay, there's no lag. Okay. I'll restart my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we do not agree with the characterization of the term climate change or its long-term problems, right? We believe that climate change is a systemic issue with short-term ramifications and long-term ramifications, and therefore there is a need for it to be addressed regardless of what problem it is. So firstly, 5 major will totally annihilate their own case because these assumptions are simply not true. First of all, the current economic insecurity is not equal to the problems that we face right now. As Stefi pointed out, energy prices, right? So this also leads to my second point is that the central bank does not have an equity principle. What does that mean? It means that the classes of society have to be equitably distributed and they have to be equally treated upon. So how does this link to gas prices? When gas prices rise, it affects the most poorest amongst us. Therefore, the central bank has a vested interest to make sure it does not disproportionately affect the poorest among us, right? And thirdly, as Stefi already pointed out, no one is saying the central bank will donate all of their time to climate change, nor will it actively engage itself in climate policy. As Stefi pointed out, it will be amongst one of the many agents that will try and combat climate change, and it's in a unique position to do so because of its monetary powers. And fourth of all, central banks do not engage with companies. This is an annoying interpretation of the central bank's mandate that's been made by the entire opposition banks. They say that the central bank can dictate, the central bank can extrapolate, the central bank can actually dictate to countries to make sure that they can ban fossil fuels. No, they cannot absolutely do that. Central banks do not have the authority to do that. What they can do is lend money to the government, who then do something with that money. The central banks, when they lend money to companies, it does not go to the companies. It gives the money to the government, and the government decides how the money goes to these companies, right? So opposition cannot claim that the central bank is independent from the government and then claim that the central bank is regulating these regulating companies completely together. I am sorry, you're misconstruing the Soviet Union with a central bank, right? So these are the fundamentally annoying interpretations that totally annihilate their own case by their own, right? They talk about exploitation, they talk about, short-term pain, which we've already pointed out to you. In the short term, the central bank has a vested interest to do so. So another point that was made by the opposing bench, which was that, the economic objectives, in financial crises, central bank has a role to make sure that the economy is booming. And I pointed out to you in a POI that there is something called as the theory of moral hazard. What does that mean? They are not only the render of last resort, is that if there is a debilitating practice and when there is no repercussions whatsoever, the central bank has the right to deny finances for unsustainable practices, which is exactly what happened during the 2008 financial crisis. Now, exploitation of minerals, making sure unsustainable climate policies are the definition of unsustainable policies, therefore creating the problem of moral hazard, which falls right under the mandate of the central bank. The central bank's role is not limited to the fact it's only economical objectives. The other assumption that they also make is that sustainable development, the economy, and climate change are three distinct identities, and they have no link or no correlation to one another, when in reality, climate change, especially climate change, is one of the reasons why there is an economical collapse. Take Australia, take the bushfires, for example. How did the bushfires affect the economy? The resources in the fires could not go to the Australian people. What happens if the Amazon rainforest burns down tomorrow? That's right. Half of the world will not get the resources that they were talking about. The central bank has a vested interest to make sure that in these cases, that when these resource debilitations happen or due to climate change, they have to bear the brunt of it. So therefore, they can be proactive, right? So these are these are fundamental problems that they, for some reason, disregard and treat them as distinct identities. Yes, I'll take a few more.
Climate change is on track to spiral out of control. At best, you push this up a few months. What is your justification for valuing that time difference over putting all effort into lowering inflation so people can survive now?
Again, thank you, which is exactly what issue, nor is it a short-term issue, is a systemic issue. And as a part of the rulemaker, as part of the government, even though independent, they have a role to play in making sure that this systemic issue does not debilitate the economy in the long run, right? The problem is when they claim that in our worst case scenario, there is an economic recession, right? In their worst case scenario, when climate change takes over, the very fact that they pointed out mass starvations, mass migrations, and most importantly, a lack of food shortages will happen in their worst case scenario. Their worst case scenario is climate annihilation, and climate annihilation world economy. So therefore, it is ludicrous to suggest to make sure that the climate change and sustainable development and the economy are three distinct identities. Proven to you systemically why there is no active correlation between climate change and the economy, and most importantly, with a pertinent example of the energy prices, as Stefi pointed out, and cryptocurrency. Now, there was a POI about the cryptocurrency which said that, the governments are going to do it anyway. The central bank has its own cryptocurrency. Precisely my point. They took that step to make sure that decentralized cryptocurrency does not happen. There is not unscrupulous mining by these small companies. Therefore, they come up with their own policy to regulate them so that the environment is not harmed, right? So you are making, therefore, the problem being is that they put the burden on us by saying that they should account for the economic recession. What we are saying to them is that your burden is to prove that why is climate change an issue worth sacrificing for short-term recession? Why is it important in the current scenario for us to say climate change is not a big enough issue, therefore the central bank should not actively engage in it? The central bank is a member of its own circumstance, and the circumstance right now is climate change is a massive problem. That therefore, due to their circumstance, they are forced to do it. And someone said that, well, fossil fuels, the 1980s, there was a problem then. More the reason why the central bank should have started earlier than right now. We are already 30 years late to address a systemic issue. So therefore, for all of these reasons, right, including debilitating assumptions being made by their case, for all of those reasons, we believe we are.
that, I'd like to thank the government whip for the fine speech, calling upon the opposition whip. Here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yep, you're visible and audible.
Thank you. I prefer PI in the chat. My time will start 3, 2, 1. I'll first engage with CG and moving on to OG and then comparing ourselves with opening opposition. So first on closing government, they have like a really interesting claim to say, there's going to be rising prices and your economy is going to suffer, and there's also going to economic recession. And on their side, there are two responses here. Number one, the time that you're using green energy is probably way much more costly comparing to use fossil fuels, and that's exactly the reason why a lot of countries, or like a lot of corporations, are not using green energy in the first place. So basically means that at the time that they want to imposing those kind of regulation, there is going to be massive cost on like those corporation and economy and their side as well. But secondly, there's going to be way much more cost, because at the time my partner told you there is a problem with economics of scale. That is, say a lot of countries, their whole manufacturing chain has already adopted a kind of machine that relies on using fossil fuels as the main energy to promoting different kinds of actions, which basically means that at the time that you want to change that into using green technology, there's probably going to be massive cost for those companies to like change their whole machine and trying to buy, purchasing other kinds of machines and utilize those machines to use the green energy. I say there is going to be way much more economic harm under their set of house. The second claim that they're trying to say is that, like central bank is not actually regulating corporations. Central bank is lending money to government and government imposing regulation. Three responses here. Number one, I just don't think this is actually true. In terms of like, this is probably like a lot of times corporations directly borrow money from banks, like they borrow money from central bank as well. I just don't see whether this is going to difference. But secondly, this characterization is not brought up by the whole opposition bench. It's brought up by opening government. They're probably going to napping them. But thirdly, I just don't understand why this is actually going to, if they say this is going to be true, how all of their like benefit is actually going to come true, because the whole OG's argument on protecting environment relies on the assumption that you are effectively going to reduce the amount of money that corporations are going to earn. I just don't understand why you lending money to government and government imposing certain kind of regulation is going to occur all those benefits that they're trying to mention. But fourthly, I said this is probably not going to be relevant to our material, because regulatory capture is going to happen no matter what. Like that is to say, for example, a really corrupted country, companies have so much lobbying power. If the government is trying to imposing regulation, those kind of regulation is going to be like influences and our side as well. So it's not going to really influence our extension here. The second thing I'm gonna do is how to engage with opening government. I think opening government did like fairly better job comparing to closing government. That is, number one, they say there is going to be like corporations are going to lose some of profit, and this is going to be really effective on protecting the environment. There's several responses here. Number one, a really important framing and contribution coming from closing opposition is to tell you how different countries have different scenarios and how they disincentivize different companies are going to be various and depends on situation. That is the one we mentioned things like regulatory capture. They're more likely going to reduce the standard to, for example, for big companies, so that they can actually help big companies to stay inside their country. And secondly, it looks like there's more likely going to be like more cost for small companies. That leads to two different impacts, right? Number one, we tell you there is going to be small companies probably going to die out in the long term. It's probably going to lead to monopoly. For example, a lot of things that there is going to be decreasing working like protection for workers. There's probably going to be massive unemployment that is actually going to exist on our side. But secondly, I think there's probably going to lead to collective action problem. That is, some like countries don't really want to lose competition to another country, which means that I feel like there is going to be fear of insecurity if my economy is weaker comparing to other country in the society. And that basically means that at the time that another country in the society, who is like my rival country, reduces standard, I'm probably also going to reduce it under our side. I just don't think like under their side it's going to be massive benefit that they're trying to claim. And thirdly, I say like I'm not scrolling the motion. I'm just like trying to actually tell you that there is going to be severe regulation and that is extremely harmful for small companies and for the companies that cannot leave the country. But if they actually achieve a certain kind of effect that they want to mention, they're probably going to be big countries moving to another country and trying to earn more profit in this case. So why this is not likely going to reach any kinds of environmental benefit that they're trying to promote in this debate? Number one, they say that corporations that shifted to another country and trying to pollute the environment there probably also contribute same kind of carbon emission to the global climate change. I just don't think this can actually preventing global climate change from happening in the first place. The second thing that you need to notice here is that it's only going to in terms of like small companies and corporations that doesn't have resources to leave, which probably don't produce that much pollution comparing to big companies that are actually going to have like larger amount of factories and industries. Certainly the best case scenario is that they're able to shift to some kinds of like big companies, things that develop nation and change the mode. I say that it doesn't matter because those big companies probably already changed that because they have their reputation cost, because they want to act environmental friendly so that they can attract more customers. I see the benefit or like the kind of change is pretty marginal in this debate. I just don't understand how they can claim that they can save millions of people's lives. The third thing I want to do here is that opening government feels like really hopeless POI. They're trying to say, economic recession is going to happen in long term and then we're going to be destroyed anyways. I say number one, they don't tell me how they can stop it. Number two, recession is going to happen because there is going to be like environmental damage. But then the thing is and they're also probably going to stop that because at the time your central bank has money, your country has money. It means that you're more likely going to adopt measures, for example, like adaptive measures, for example, like building up, helping a lot of people moving away from coastal areas and providing welfare to those people. I say this is more likely going to happen under our side and making those people not likely going to suffer. But in comparison, under their side, you're more likely going to directly go into recession in the first place and making a lot of people just directly die. Before that, I'm going to take a VOI from OG.
So this new idea about adaptation doesn't deal with the fact that climate change as a whole is massively destructive. How are you going to adapt to 5 Hurricane Katrinas a year?
No, like you didn't prove why you can prevent climate change from happening in the first place. I'm just not willing to further engage on that. But then let's compare our house with opening opposition, right? Opening opposition claim is to say, companies are going to die, they're going to cut people and people will suffer. And they provide no mechanism why this is going to be true. I say this is really problematic. Number one, I'm not clear about how many companies are going to be influenced. Number two, sometimes the open government, closing government can say, a lot of people are going to die in environmental harm, blah, 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 and then that directly always. We say on the same metric, we provide you why this is more likely going to economic recession because of 2 reasons. Number one, we tell you there's going to be small companies die out because more likely going to form monopoly, more likely going to occur things like regulatory capture. Number two, we tell you that the central bank who cannot actually gain money from those big companies are more likely just going to have sufficient funding because they rely on sending loans, sending bonds to earn money in the first place. If central bank doesn't have money, I just don't understand how can other business survive in your industry in the very first place. And that probably leads to massive amount of unemployment that is more likely going to exist in the status quo and more likely going to cause severe tangible harm on the people. For all those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank the opposition group for that fine speech. That brings us to an end of this particular round. I'd like all the 4 teams to virtually cross swords and engage in debate. If all the observers and all the